All right, I'll get started and we can let other folks join as they start to turn their attention towards the webinar and lunchtime. A few sort of logistical things. First, we're going to do a presentation, sort of recap a lot of the work we've been doing on 30 by 30 all summer. And then afterwards, we're going to have some time for a Q&A session. And so on this Zoom webinar, there is a Q&A option. So we'll ask that rather than putting your questions in chat, that you put your questions into the Q&A box so we can sort of go through those at the end. And so with that, I will get started, and I will start by saying, hi, my name is Abby Mohan, and I am one of the 30 by 30 program managers here at the Ocean Protection Council. I know some of you have joined us on some of our previous sessions, and some are new to the 30 by 30 team and the 30 by 30 process. So we'll just get started with doing some introductions. So my name's Abby, and I'll pass it over to Mike real quick.
Thanks, Abby. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. Mike Escrow. I'm a senior scientist, senior program manager here at OPC. I lead our biodiversity team, so I'm really working closely with my colleagues, Ann and Abby, on all things 30 by 30. I'll pass it over to Ann.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. My name's Andy. I'm the other 30 by 30 program manager. Happy to be here, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Excellent. And okay, all right, I'll get us kicked off. And I just want to give a shout out. This summer we had Mina Adabag, who was our 30 by 30 OPC summer intern. And we are, of course, led by Jen Eckerly, the executive director for the Ocean Protection Council. However, we have been working in close collaboration with the Ocean Science Trust on developing this framework and on the 30 by 30 process. In particular, the executive director, Dr. Liz Whiteman, and science officer, Dr. Heidi Waite. We've been working closely with them along this whole process. And we were also joined at one of our workshops this summer by their CSU Coast summer intern, Leah Escobar. So let's get started. 30 by 30. In October 2020, Governor Newsom issued Executive Order N8220 committing California to conserving 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, or the 30 by 30 target. This really put California at the leading edge of this international movement. It was later adopted domestically as the America the Beautiful initiative, and then in 2022 was signed in Montreal at the Convention on Biological Diversity by over 200 nations. This 30 by 30 initiative in California has three main priorities. First, to protect and restore biodiversity, and also to expand access to nature and mitigate and build resilience to climate change. So in 2022, the California Natural Resource Agency released Pathways to 30 by 30, which really released and detailed a lot of the strategies and some of the opportunities that we've identified in achieving 30 by 30. And really importantly, Pathways gave us a definition of what is a 30 by 30 conservation area. And that is a land and coastal water area that is durably protected and managed to sustain functional ecosystems, both intact and restored, and the diversity of life that they support. So right now, our state MPA network of 124 marine protected areas covering 16.2% of coastal waters aligns with this definition of conservation set forth in Pathways. So how are we going to get to the other 14%? OPC has identified four primary approaches to getting to the 30% target by 2030. And so today's presentation really centers on the science-based framework to evaluate and advance these approaches. The first approach is adaptively managing the state's MPA network. The second is strengthening biodiversity conservation in our federally managed National Marine Sanctuary System. The third is supporting tribally led conservation, including through the creation of indigenous marine stewardship areas. And the fourth is exploring the role of conservation contributions that all of the other managed areas have in the state of California. So in order to develop this framework, we were really fortunate to pull together a really phenomenal technical advisory panel. This panel is composed of experts that have been working in California on fisheries, human dimensions, ecological, climate change, and also some experts that have been working internationally in order to look at some evaluating the conservation benefits of area-based management. This is actually really hard stuff, trying to figure out how to evaluate area-based management and to evaluate biodiversity in coastal waters. And so this panel has been working really hard, meeting all through the winter and through the spring and this summer, and they will continue to support us on 30 by 30 as we move forward through the next steps of the process. So the international scientific community has been grappling with the challenge of evaluating conservation outcomes for area-based management for many years, and has developed some really robust tools for evaluating the effectiveness. And so to develop this framework, we are relying on multiple resources and international guidance, including the MPA Guide, the International Union for Conservation of Nature site-level tool for evaluating other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, as well as a lot of guidance specific to California, including reports to the OPC Science Advisory Panel on building climate resilience in our marine protected area network, and also lessons learned from the first decadal management review of California's MPA network. So the first step in the process of evaluating these area-based management measures is looking at durability. This is really key to 30 by 30, and this definition was laid out in Pathways. And durable protection is pretty simple. It just means anything that has gone through a formal process and is not easily undone. So these are areas with species and habitat protections that are not subject to that simple reversal. So the real heart of 30 by 30 is looking at biodiversity and how do we evaluate biodiversity. And there are a lot of different areas that exist within the waters of California. Some of these areas were created primarily for biodiversity, and for those areas, we're going to evaluate them using the MPA Guide. The MPA Guide is a science-based policy-relevant framework first published in Science in 2021, and since has released a significant amount of expanded guidance and a lot of other peer-reviewed publications to support and continue to further the science from this framework. The MPA Guide has 5 outcomes when you go to evaluate area-based management using the MPA Guide. It starts to look at the stage of establishment, the enabling conditions, but really the heart of the MPA Guide looks at the level of protection. There's a lot of different activities that happen within an area, and all of these activities happen on a spectrum. So whether it's anchoring, dredging, infrastructure, aquaculture, fishing, a variety of different activities can have a spectrum of impacts. And so the MPA Guide categorizes these activities into different impact categories, which really gets you to a level of protection. And the first 2 types of level of protection that come out are incompatible or minimally protected. Things that are deemed incompatible or minimally protected mean that, for whatever reason they were created, the outcomes that are expected based on the activities that are happening in that area aren't sufficient enough to conserve biodiversity. For areas that are lightly protected, highly protected, or fully protected, it does show that there are biodiversity conservation outcomes that can benefit biodiversity in the long term. And those areas will go forward as candidates for 30 by 30. The second pathway is looking at areas that were created for reasons other than biodiversity conservation. This could be fishery management areas, water quality protection areas. And so for this, we'll be using the IUCN site level tool for OECMs, which is just an acronym that just means another type of conservation area. And using this tool allows us to evaluate. And when we evaluate using the OECM tool, we're really trying to get to that likely outcome and look at the biodiversity values that exist in an area, the threats and pressures, and then what are the management actions that are happening, and is it sufficient to abate or mitigate those threats and pressures to biodiversity that you can get to a similar level of biodiversity conservation as a protected area. So when you do this evaluation process using the IUCN OECM tool, it's a little bit more straightforward. It comes out as, yes, or no. And if it no doesn't qualify as an OECM, it just means it doesn't mean that it's not providing whatever it was created to do. It just means that that type of protection isn't enough to sufficient enough to conserve biodiversity as a whole. If a site does not qualify as an OECM, we'll work with management and see if there's opportunities to strengthen the management within that site in order to allow it to qualify. However, if a site does qualify as an OECM, then it remains a candidate for 30 by 30. And the other priorities that were identified in pathways are looking at access and at climate. So for final steps, we'll be exploring access and climate benefits for all 30 by 30 conservation areas. And some of these potential benefits that they could be providing would be for a variety of access opportunities and inclusive opportunities for people, California Native American tribes, robust outreach and education programming, or providing environmental quality that will can be benefit nearby communities. We're also looking at potential climate benefits of 30 by 30 conservation areas, such as whether a habitat is providing storage and sequestration of carbon, or has the potential to serve as climate refugia, or whether management is supporting climate adaptation and resilience and providing sufficient monitoring in order to be able to adaptively manage the area long term. So everything I just said was a lot of information packed into a short period of time, and it's kind of a recap of what we've released in this 30 by 30 draft decision-making framework for coastal waters, and we'll be dropping in some links in the chat that will include links to this framework so you can read the full framework. So right now, today's workshop, you are here today as part of our closeout webinar. This is built upon a really extensive process. This process started back in June when we presented at our Ocean Protection Council meeting, and then we had a virtual kickoff webinar that had a really great, robust conversation. And then since then, Anne, Mike, Connor, and I have gone on a pretty phenomenal tour around the state of California, starting with an in-person regional workshop in Southern California and San Diego back in July. And then in Monterey, in August, we went to Monterey. And just last week, we were up in the North Coast in Arcata. So after this, there's still opportunity for public comment until October 2nd. After October 2nd, we're going to take all of the input that we have and all of the conversations that we have had during this process and then go back and review it all with our technical advisory panel. And we anticipate releasing the final evaluation process and beginning evaluations at and after our December council meeting with the Ocean Protection Council. So in addition to those regional workshops, like I said, we've been doing in-person regional workshops. We've also in parallel been doing tribal roundtables, and we've already had those in Central and Northern California, and we are in the process of scheduling one for Southern California. We've also been presenting at National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council meetings, had a lot of meetings with recreational and commercial fishing communities, met with some coalitions of NGOs, and presented to other state and federal agency partners and groups. This entire process has had a parallel tribal consultation process that has happened alongside of it. So we've really been trying to get out and have as many conversations with as diverse of people as we can in order to take feedback on this process and then move it to the final framework so we can start evaluating and trying to get our numbers from 16% and start to designate more areas as part of 30 by 30. So some of the things that we've been hearing along this process in Southern California in July 10th, one really great thing about my job in this process has been we've been at one beautiful location after another. Down at Scripps, as we really heard, priority should be biodiversity over access, and that enforcement and education is really needed in current areas. This workshop had great attendance with fishermen, NGOs, community members, tribes, and sister agency partners all coming together. We heard a lot about the impacts of the sewage in the Tijuana River estuary are causing, and really how important it is to support enforcement of MPA regulations and protecting MPAs from the spread of invasive species. And then key tribal partners at this workshop really expressed a desire for tribally focused conversations, which led us to plan those dedicated tribal roundtables that we've been conducting all summer. Then we went to Monterey in the Central Coast, and this brought together a lot of commercial and recreational fishing communities, NGOs, and some more agency partners and local community members. Here we really heard a lot about how the mudslides and the closure in Big Sur have impacted access along the coast, and worries about the interactions with watershed management and coastal water quality. And we've also really heard about the importance of tailoring international guidance to be specific for the California context and to make sure we take into consideration local science and management activities. Up in the North Coast workshop, we brought together commercial fishermen, community members, and some local NGOs. There was a lot of excitement up in the North Coast about IMSAs and what they could mean and the possibilities for tribal stewardship. There was a lot of concern about offshore wind and how the industrialization of the port will impact the bay and the wildlife that is there now. The connections of fish to upland water habitat was really an important species, and making sure that the freshwater rivers of 30 by 30 are connected to the coastal water areas was brought up repeatedly. There was also a lot of restoration success stories that were shared, from dune restorations in Humboldt and restoration of rivers and estuaries along the coast. So that is kind of a recap of what we have been up to all summer and a quick overview of our draft evaluation framework and some of the things that we've been hearing along this process. Today's wrap-up webinar is really intended to, here, I'll bring this up so I can see people again. Today's webinar is really intended to have that last opportunity for public comment and to have continue that discussion. So with that, I will look at the chat and the Q&A and see what we got. Anne, can I let you facilitate this?
You got it, Abby. And for folks who want to raise your hand, it's with the react button. You just click that and there's a raise hand option. We'll be bouncing back and forth between the raise hand and the Q&A. There are no current questions in the Q&A.
Mike or Anne, do you have any other reflections from the workshops that you'd like to share?
I have one. And Abby, that was a phenomenal presentation. So thanks for that kind of recap of our decision-making framework and the feedback that we've heard on this awesome roadshow that we've been doing, getting out into communities and hearing folks' thoughts on how 30 by 30 can support their priorities in their particular own backyards. So that's been awesome. I think my overarching take home from those workshops is that I think some folks went in expecting to see kind of a top-down process, right? And that's really not what 30 by 30 is. We really are trying to mirror the spirit of what the land side of 30 by 30 is doing, and really move forward with partnership-based conservation. So you're not going to see, OPC or other state agencies starting to draw lines on a map saying we need to conserve these areas, right? We really want to think with local communities about what is the most important in terms of biodiversity, and what those threats, those regional and locally driven threats might be, and then work in partnership with folks to think through how we might institute new protections, new conservation measures, basically how 30 by 30 can support what's coming to us kind of from the ground up, right? That was a conversation we had at each of these regional workshops, so I think it bears repeating on this statewide webinar.
Yeah, I would totally support that, Mike. I would say it was like really inspiring to hear all the different like conservation success stories along the way and a lot of the ideas that the different communities had for these for sort of new areas or different ways. And people wanting to know, well, how do I make it durable? How do I work through that durable process? How do we help work through the public process for that and sort of get counted?
Totally. We have questions now in the Q&A and in the chat, and I'll just go in order of when they came in. First question is from John Calloway. Have any more details been developed about how estuarine areas will be handled as part of the framework since they are quite different than the marine MPAs?
Thanks for that, John. Yeah, estuaries were brought up repeatedly at almost every workshop as being areas that were really important to a lot of communities. So we definitely know we want to take a very close and careful look at the estuaries along the coast. As far as the way that they are being handled, the evaluation of the framework process really gets to that question of biodiversity conservation. Is whatever type of management that exists in this area sufficient in order to protect biodiversity in this area? One thing that was sort of specific that's come out of this process through some of the small group conversations we've had is just how critical water quality is in an estuary and to a lot of the biodiversity and habitat areas within an estuary. And so looking at those estuary areas and how some water quality protections can really help support the biodiversity in those areas. So the evaluation isn't habitat specific or site specific, whether it's a marine area or an estuary area. The evaluation is getting to that fundamental question of, does this meet that bar of conservation for 30 by 30? So there's not going to be like a difference in the evaluation, but what meets that bar, what supports biodiversity, is going to be different on the open coast than in an estuary. And that will definitely be taken into consideration in the evaluation.
Thanks, Abby. The next question that we have comes from Anupa. Do you have updates on when the climate and access criteria will be released?
I don't think we have any updates on that.
No, I will say that we're sort of I don't know. I think we thought we were a little bit closer than we were on having those ready for release, and we've been having some internal conversations and conversations with other partners as well about maybe some ways we could strengthen those considerations. So I'm not sure you'll see those in the next week or so, but we're gonna continue to think through that. So apologies for the delay on that. I know we've been promising to release them, but we want to really get it right.
You. Next question comes from an anonymous participant, but are there interim goals between now and 2030 that could serve as checkpoints?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So it we have so 30 by 30 was originally this executive order that later got codified into legislation, and as part of this we have a progress report that is due to the legislation every year. But this report actually, we try to really show the progress that happens and take all of those ambitions and objectives that are in pathways and sort of tie the actions that we're doing year after year to those. And we just released the 2024 Pathways Progress Report, I think like September 9th or like within the past week or two, that just sort of came out, which was really great. So that progress report will come out every year. And that progress report is kind of that checkpoint that we have in order to show that measurable progress. So I think you can expect to look to that on a yearly basis for um, some meeting some of the objectives.
Awesome. And I just dropped a link to that progress report that Abby mentioned in the chat as well, if folks are interested in looking at that. The next question we have comes from Jen Hyman. I'd like to encourage taking sea level rise into account and how it will turn some land areas into coastal areas in the future. So you may want to protect upland areas that will/could be converted into tidal wetlands.
Yeah, I would say to that point, one thing that we also heard a lot about is how important the land-sea interface is for so many different communities, and how critical taking that full picture view into account is. And so we are working closely with the land side. We are trying to draw connections between those complementary conservation areas, whether it's a land side protection or designation of a 30 by 30 area that's like a wetland. We want to make sure that we sort of look at the coastal waters that are benefiting from some of those upland protections. And then, like I said, on the Central Coast, having that watershed perspective, that full sort of spectrum, was something that was brought up repeatedly. So we definitely have heard loud and clear that we want to make sure that we stay connected with the land process and the sea process, so they're not being done in isolation.
Perfect. I see Greg Helms has his hand raised. Greg, please feel free to unmute, come on screen. Sorry, Greg, it's really hard to hear you. Could you try one more time?
Oh, we can't hear you.
I think he's going to type his question in the chat.
Perfect.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Greg.
Greg. Perfect. While Greg is typing that question, we have another question in the chat, a follow-up from Anupa. Would you consider an extension on comments then so we can review the proposed access criteria, or should we move forward with submitting recommendations?
I think it would be smart to move forward with submitting recommendations, but we'd also certainly consider a request for an extension. We've had a number of comments from folks saying, hey, how, like, what's the process going to be in between the closing of public comment, the closing of tribal consultation, and the presentation of a final framework, which we've been tentatively planning for our December council meeting. And we're kind of taking a pause to be thoughtful about that, because we want to, there's time pressure here to get this thing finalized so we can start making some decisions and moving forward with implementation. But we also want to make sure that we're offering ample opportunity for folks to weigh in. So we'll follow up with more details on kind of what the process will be to, submit recommendations or questions or comments following the closure of the formal comment period on October 2nd.
All right. Question from Greg. It seems from the framework you're expecting all the needed 30 by 30 zones would come from existing MPAs/OECMs. Does that seem right?
No, actually not completely. We are expecting that to meet that 30% goal because we are setting a pretty high bar for conservation. We expect that through the evaluation process, that while there may be some areas that currently exist that will meet that bar of conservation, in addition to our state's marine MPA network, we don't think that we're going to be getting to 30% through that. Also, IMSAs are a new concept, and how IMSAs that will exist sort of in the real world is still being sort of formatted and figured out through this process. And a lot of the managing agencies, for example, the Greater Farallones Marine Sanctuary is in the process of updating their management plan, and they may have additional areas or zones that they create as part of this management plan process. So I don't think it comes from what exists right now. And we also anticipate a big component of this process is strengthening what exists right now. So even if it is something that exists right now, like a water quality protection area, an underwater state park, a fishery management area, etc., it may end up being strengthened as part of this evaluation process. So it may not the lines on the map may stay the same, but the actual management of the area might be strengthened as part of this process.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Abby. The only thing I'd add to that is, we haven't finalized the framework yet, right? So we don't have the final tool with which to do evaluations. But my suspicion, just having been involved in this and talking to Abby and looking at everything that's out there, I don't think we're going to get through this exercise and say, oh, look, we're already at 30. I think like Abby said, I think we've set our bar pretty high. So that's kind of what I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting about those local partnerships, right? That's kind of where that figures in, where, okay, if we have a delta, right, a gap to make up to get to 30%, we need to start thinking about what biodiversity protections, what new protections would be meaningful. I'll just kind of give you an idea of some of the things we've been talking about with partners. New water quality protections that target estuaries. We've had some really interesting conversations with some local stewardship groups. For example, things like designating surf reserves in partnership with a local government, like a city or a county government. I'm not sure. I mean, that's kind of a very unexplored idea, but these are the sorts of bottom up kind of ideas that we want to be hearing, because we do anticipate that there's going to be some new stuff that we need to do to get to 30%.
One of the really amazing things about this process and coming through it, I would say, like, we were trying so hard to get a framework together and put it out for public comment, but then the public comment period has been actually really phenomenal because we've made a lot of connections all up and down the coast and with a lot of other partners and agencies, and heard a lot of the other ways that different communities are sort of thinking about this. And so like Mike was saying, we've really started to see that. We think that getting to that 30 by cent is going to be sort of like little bit by little bit, building a new partnership, strengthening this management with this agency and this group and this organization. So we sort of see that iterative progress, and then that'll all be released within that progress report on a yearly basis.
Thanks, team. Greg just put a follow-up question in the chat. That's the work within areas managers box on the diagram, it looks like. Do you have a mechanism in mind for designating new areas as necessary in terms of what state authority would be used?
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant. Oh, sorry, Abby, please go for it.
I was just gonna say that the OPC is not a regulatory agency. We partner with a lot of different agencies, and so whatever state authority would be used would be very relative to the type of protections. And so, for example, within an estuary, if we're thinking about water quality, we would be working with that local water board or the state water resources control board to work on a new water quality protection area. If we're looking at some sort of fishery management, that would be CDFW. So the state authority would just be whatever agency is relevant to the regulatory protections we're looking at. Yeah.
There are currently no raised hands, no new questions. I guess maybe during this lull, I can quickly share what my big takeaway from like the workshops was. And for me, that was just the huge sense of community. I think that this is, as Abby has mentioned multiple times, really hard work tackling the question of how do we navigate area-based management for biodiversity and biodiversity outcomes. And just kind of like the biggest joy and really huge pleasure of this workshop series so far was meeting folks as yourself up and down the coast and hearing why the California coast and the ocean and all of those wonderful creatures and habitats mean to you personally, because I think that really is part of this bottom up approach and why we want to protect these special places and these special habitats. So just a big shout out to you all also making time during your day to come to this online workshop. And would you look at that, another question. All right, so in regard to water quality protections, as an example, to submit a proposal for all existing MPs to be protected for water quality too, what is the mechanism? I know some are working on it, but seems there needs to be more pressure from the public to move it forward.
Yeah, so having all MPAs have also be water quality protection areas was one of the strategic goals in OPC's last strategic plan that we've been sort of working on. And it is being done regionally. The way that water quality protection areas go is this conversation between the regional water quality board, the state water resources control board, and I'm pretty sure that it is also a community nominated sort of process for that. So, that is one of the goals and strategies that OPC is working towards, is to increase water quality protections in MPAs, and it is a slow iterative process. I would say that the answer would be yes, that more public pressure to move it forward and pressure engaging with those regional water boards and stuff through their mechanisms and process would be beneficial. So we'll give it like another minute, and then if no one has any questions, we can probably end this a little early and let everyone have a little bit quieter of the end of their lunch hour.
Currently no raised hands, no new questions, nothing in the chat so far.
Well, I want to say thank you because a few of you that are here have shown up for us before and been like very visible on this whole process. And some of the names that are on the screen I don't know before. So thank you for engaging in this part of the process. I hope you have found this public comment bit beneficial, but I'll just reiterate and emphasize the public comment is open until October 2nd, and dropped the links. We have a public comment form that you can submit. You can also just email us at 30by30 coastalwaters@resources.ca.gov. And so with that, we may end our webinar now, but we are still open to continue this conversation and dialogue. And then if you want to see the next phase of this process, just keep your eye on the agenda for the Ocean Protection Council meetings. And at one of our upcoming meetings, we will be presenting the final framework. Do you have any other final words, Mike or Ann?
No, just echoing everyone's thanks for attending today. And yeah, hope to keep the conversation going. Public comment ends on October 2nd, and tribal consultation will wrap on November 1st. So hope to speak more with many of you as we approach the finalization of this framework. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
But thank you. Bye.
Bye.